Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. In the last podcast, I forecast a discussion about the Australia-UK submarine construction treaty, not realising that as I was speaking it was actually being tabled in Parliament House, so it's been available for about a week. Formally, it's called the Nuclear-Powered Submarine Partnership and Collaboration Agreement between the Government of Australia and the Government of the UK, of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. To call it a framework, I think, is a little bit too generous, and as usual, I would be very surprised if our Defence Minister Richard Marles has bothered reading it, even though it's quite short, 28 pages, bit of double spacing in there. But I'll mention a couple of general things before going into some specifics. All of the hoo-ha surrounding its announcement was that this is a 50-year treaty, which might sound impressive. No, it's not a 50-year treaty. It naturally expires in 2075. It does have that date in there, but it can be terminated by either party with 1 year's notice in writing. Now, by the same standards, you could call it a 10 million year treaty. The effect is the same. It will be in place until either 2075 or one or both of the parties decides that it's no longer necessary or they can't be bothered with it. So that's not a particularly good start, in my opinion. Another part of it that I do object to is that it again seeks to codify the alleged benefits of nuclear-powered submarines, saying, and this is a direct quote, SSNs, when compared to traditional submarines, maintain superior characteristics of stealth, speed, maneuverability, survivability, and almost limitless endurance. Now, I've dealt with this in the past, but let me just quickly recap. Now, several of those assertions are contested. Yes, they do have greater speed, particularly sustained speed, no problem with that. Stealth, though, is very contested. It depends on the mission. Nuclear-powered submarines do not need to come to the surface as frequently as conventionally powered submarines, though that equation alters when you are talking about a conventional powered submarine with air-independent propulsion, meaning that they can also remain underwater for extended periods of time, around 20 days is the current figure. And with another important component of stealth is the noise that a submarine makes, the noise that it generates. Now, the advantage of conventionally powered submarines is that they can go completely silent. They can run off batteries, and they're really dead quiet. With a nuclear-powered submarine, no matter how much acoustic protection you build into the design, it's still powered by a nuclear reactor, which is the modern-day equivalent of a steam engine. You've got about, instead of coal, you've got 250 kilos of uranium, approximately, that generates a tremendous amount of heat, and you use it to boil water. That, in turn, spins big turbines and makes the propeller turn, and you can't shut that off. If you were to shut that off, all of the systems in the submarine would shut down. You do have a small amount of battery capacity there, but not very much. Yes, you can put measures in place that lowers the amount of noise the turbine's making, but you can't eliminate it completely. So that's contested as well. Depends on the circumstances, depends on the mission. That's as far as I want to go. Maneuverability? No, I think that's just dead wrong. Nuclear-powered submarines are generally much larger than conventionally powered submarines, and I cannot understand how anyone could possibly claim that they are more maneuverable. That's just wrong. Then, survivability? Well, survivability depends on these other characteristics, principally stealth. And there are plenty of people around who argue very convincingly that a modern conventional diesel-electric submarine is in fact more survivable than a nuclear boat. They're, smaller, harder to detect, all of that sort of thing. And that explains why so many countries are continuing to acquire them. The final bit, almost limitless endurance. Well, again, submarine endurance is limited basically by the amount of food that you can carry on board and the mental health of your crew. Nuclear-powered submarines, you wouldn't really go beyond a 3-month mission, a 90-day mission. Conventional subs like Collins, at 60, you can push that a little bit more. So, okay, yeah, you've got a bit more endurance. But, seeking to, in writing, in a treaty, falsely build up the technical advantages of nuclear-powered submarines, I just think is wrong. And I think it is just part of this continuing false narrative that only a nuclear-powered submarine can possibly meet Australia's requirements. I just don't believe it's true. And another section, and I actually laughed when I read the following sentence, said, "This reaffirms our commitment to a peaceful, stable, prosperous Indo-Pacific region and support of the international rules-based order." In case anyone hasn't noticed, the Trump administration has no interest in the international rules-based order and seems to be doing everything in its power to undermine it. And I'll have a lot more to say about that shortly. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I have read plenty of these things in the past, and so I'm just going to pick out a few paragraphs to give you a bit of a feel for the document, and of course anyone's able to read it online. If there are any lawyers out there who want to do a bit of pro bono work, please have a look. Send me an email, what you think. Okay, first section. The agreement builds, this is outlining what it's all about, and this is fair enough. The agreement builds upon Australia's strong, cooperative and enduring defence partnership with the UK. Well, I'm not sure how strong it is, and makes legally binding commitments to develop a new class of SSN based on the UK's next generation design, incorporating technology from the UK, Australia, and the US. The US is not a party to the treaty, but it's mentioned there. Now, what it doesn't mention, there's no discussion at all of work share arrangements or specific costs. A lot of this is kind of legal boilerplate. The agreement provides that the receiving party, so this is Australia receiving nuclear submarines initially from the UK, waives all claims for liability on the government-to-government transfer of equipment and material or provision of services. Okay, well, I'm not sure that I'd be waiving all liabilities at this stage. Then, the agreement provides that any differences or disputes arising in the implementation and interpretation of this agreement shall be resolved through mutual consultation between the parties without recourse to any other dispute settlement mechanisms. Again, I have my concerns about that. In other contracts that I've been involved in, you have a provision there for arbitration, because sometimes the two parties are at loggerheads and you need access to the legal system to resolve that. That's quite normal in the world of defence contracting. This one says, no, it's up to Australia and the UK to sort out their differences, but no explanation about what happens if that can't be done, except we know what will happen because the UK is the design authority for this, and basically the agreement says that it will consult with Australia, but it controls the process. Oh, here we go. The agreement provides that the SSN AUKUS shall have a common design. The parties are required to cooperate together and with the US, not a party to the agreement, in developing the common design by incorporating technologies from all three nations. Doesn't say what those technologies are. Here we go. The agreement provides that the UK shall lead the development and approval of the common design, and Australia shall participate in the design development process. So that's very clear. The UK can and will do whatever it wants. We can participate in the design development process, but if our views can just be totally ignored, well, it's not a lot of benefit to us in that. On costs, it says, frankly and accurately, It is not possible to estimate costs that will be incurred in connection with the agreement at this time. Sure. Any costs that may arise in connection with this agreement will be negotiated in mutually determined arrangements between Australia and the UK on a proportionate, justifiable, fair and mutually transparent basis, blah, blah, blah. The Office of Impact Analysis has advised the Australian Submarine Agency that an impact analysis is not required. Now, that's a curious one. To be honest, I've never heard of the Office of Impact Analysis, but I had a look. It's part of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and describes how important it is, saying impact analysis is important. Impact analysis helps policymakers consider how proposals affect businesses, individuals, and community organisations, as well as broader economic and other impacts. Strong, evidence-based impact analysis is a powerful tool when applied intentionally and consistently. The Australian government's policy impact analysis framework ensures that decision makers are supported with the necessary evidence base and that policy options are well designed, well targeted, and fit for purpose. But there, it's been ruled out. We're not going to get that for the SSN AUKUS. No explanation for why that's the case. It strikes me as a major deficiency. It's a bit like the Hunter-class frigate program evaluation, which completely ignored Defence's normal obligation to do a cost-benefit analysis of the tender proposal. Okay, let's switch topics to the US, because again, a lot of relevant stuff has been happening there. And again, I'm trying to phrase all of this in terms of Australia's national security. I'm not quite so interested in the economics of it all, but I want everyone to view these things through the prism of how reliable the US is. And again, there's more tariff uncertainty and chaos. There's almost no point trying to keep up with what's happening each day because there are so many changes. I do want to highlight a couple of them. The US tariff rate on Canada will now be 35%, apparently because Canada has had the temerity, along with the vast majority of countries in the world, to recognize a Palestinian state. And Canada also politically looks like it won't be pushed around by the US, so they're getting 35%. And as I mentioned previously, 50% on Brazil, because they have, again, the temerity to put their former president, Mr. Bolsonaro, on trial for trying to subvert the outcome of the previous presidential election. A big one is coming up on August 12th. That, I think, is the next date. For China, I suspect that one is just going to be pushed further down the road. An EU deal? Yes, the EU appears to have caved on some aspects of it, but when the Trump administration was announcing this EU deal, it talked about the EU agreeing to buy a lot more US military hardware. And I thought, no, that's going in the wrong direction. That's not what should be happening. The EU was doing the right thing earlier in the year when they were setting up their own fund and announced that they were going to massively ramp up their own capabilities. And guess what? It turns out that the EU is correct and that the Trump administration has been telling fibs. No, there's no commitment there for them to buy US military hardware. That was just in the mind, it would seem, of President Donald Trump. Europe is going full steam ahead, increasing their independence. Australia should be doing the same thing. Now, with all of this stuff, I still remain of the view that it's probably best if our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, never actually meets Donald Trump. I can't see a meeting going well. The two of them have nothing in common. My advice is keep a very low profile on all of this. Just hope that it doesn't get any worse. But, of course, there's a good chance that it will. And I noticed on the weekend a report in the Sydney Morning Herald by Matthew Knott, extremely good defence correspondent. I know Matthew well. He's a good fellow. Matthew had a little scoop. I'll read from it. US and Australian officials were planning to meet some of the nation's top defence experts in Canberra on Monday and Tuesday, next week, for the fifth round of the US-Australia Indo-Pacific Deterrence Dialogue, but the event was suddenly called off on Wednesday when the American officials were told they were no longer allowed to travel to the event, which, again, just for me, is further evidence of the deteriorating relationship between Australia and the United States in the security domain. And in that context, I really wonder about the future of the AUSMIN talks, which between Australia and the US, they started in the mid-80s, their annual consultations, very high level, between the Australian Foreign Minister and Defence Minister and their US counterpart, in this case the Secretary of State and their Secretary of Defence. Now, there was talk about that happening in August or September, but I see no evidence that it's going to take place. It might. But I tell you what, if that doesn't go ahead, that should really have more alarm bells ringing. I also note that the US has not appointed an ambassador to Australia. Shows how much they think of us. In Trump presidency 1.0, the position was vacant for about 2 years. Okay, it's now only been 6 months or whatever, so we shouldn't be stressing yet. But let's keep an eye on that one. If we were a high priority, we would clearly have a US ambassador, a Trump apparatchik, undoubtedly. Now, the mood amongst our politicians and security officials is that they have convinced themselves collectively that there's nothing to worry about because everything will return to normal after the Trump presidency. But I make the observation that hoping for something isn't a substitute for good policy, and we should already have started this process of shifting away from the US as a source of military equipment supply. And that needs to come in two main components: ramping up our own industrial capabilities as rapidly as possible and seeking to source equipment, particularly from the region. South Korea remains at the top of my list, but there are opportunities with Japan as well, and I'll be going into some of those in a future article. I don't see any signs of activity at all, and frankly, it is really starting to alarm me. And in this regard, I also noticed an online article by Professor Paul Dibb, who I know quite well, one of Australia's great strategic thinkers, incredibly well connected. He's got a CV as long as my arm. And he warned that, along the lines that I've been discussing, that Australia's military is depressingly weak. It has not grown in size at all in the last 40 years. Equipment has been refreshed, and he points out the obvious, that on a good day, we could get a couple of Collins-class submarines to sea. Our surface fleet is insignificant. At best, the Army could field 2 battalions, that's about 2,000 troops, and supporting equipment, and that the Air Force would be able to maintain combat air patrols, but only for a very few days. It's just so blindingly obvious that we are way under strength, and I see no way forward other than a recognition of this and a recognition of the urgency about this from our government. But, of course, they remain just extraordinarily complacent, talking about these ramp-ups, which are basically going to occur in the 2030s, if at all. Also, as I mentioned before, C3000 coming to a head, it looks like. I can't predict the outcome of that. I've written about the bidders. You're welcome to do a Google search if you're interested in the detail. But just to give you an example, one example of how effed up this process has been, one of the characteristics that the two bidders were asked to address was interoperability, but Defence didn't define what interoperability means. And I can tell you both the Japanese bid and the German bid have taken different approaches. How can you possibly have an evaluation when you cannot even define what it is that you want? Interesting times. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.